Welcome to Coursera's YouTube Masterclass. I'm Aaron Sheley. This is my class. I'm a professor, Dr. Sheley. I got my PhD at Calarts, got my MFA at the AFI, American Film Institute, and I got my bachelor's at University of Southern California. And I got a Doctor of Arts from commuting all the other degrees I got, which was many, and I'm not going to sit here and brag. I'm just telling my credentials before we move on, so you know that I know what I'm talking about, that I went to USC Film School and studied film extensively throughout my life is true, and that I'm a film historian at the Library of Congress is also a remote job I have. But the only reason I bring this up is because we haven't discussed credentials, and I feel like I've been weighing hard on you to understand the meaning of all these movies, if there is any meaning, or if we should even search for meaning, or if the point of the movie is to not have meaning, then where do we watch the movie and get something out of it? Where does the phenomenology, the experience of watching a movie just come in handy as a life tool necessity that we all have? We can all understand and assimilate all these cuts together that are montages with these scenes and sequences and shots. So where do we fall when we experience a movie? And really, that is a theoretical basis. I mean, we could say that things that embrace our desire for the sublime and to create catharsis, conflict resolution, these things create endorphins in our brain. Anxiety in a film, contrary-wise, typically does not cause anxiety in the viewer because they know eventually it's going to be resolved. But there are cases where the anxiety is so much there that it can cause nervousness. However, typically the art form, as William James, the psychologist, would say, is not the medium that transpires whatever the feeling is the character has onto the other person. But I've known people, in fact, my wife, that I brought up before in this class, she watches a movie. She can only see like G-rated movies because even then it's too scary for her. She gets into the movie, thinks she's in it. She thinks she's in the box, like the Stendhal syndrome, where you're standing in front of a painting and suddenly you're in the painting. Well, let's go into a few paintings and see if we can't understand if it's meaning that creates the phenomenology. And in this case, is it the desire of the sublime feeling from the desire? Now, we could also say that hypnosis is kind of a medium of film, but since that's kept under wraps as to how they do it, because it can actually be done, it has to be done by a professional hypnotist. All we'll know of it as film buffs is the scenes in movies where people get hypnotized and do stuff, like Dr. Mabuse by Fritz Lang. When he hypnotizes everybody with like this magic show, he's already luring them in behind the curtain into like this nightmare world where we saw with Caligari that the sleepwalking somnambulist is also hypnotized. And we saw in La Vampire when the hypnotic eyes have this guy Moreno hypnotizing the vampires and everybody gets hypnotized. And, and we believe in it as filmmakers, but we never have the hypnotist on the set usually tell us how it's done, because I've had a lot of things happen on my set. Like a bat showed up on a vampire movie once, and I was like, I'm not going to question it. whoever put that there is cool. But Nanook of the North is the movie. I wanted to talk about the silent film of the week because we got a lot more silent films to get through, but I don't want to bag them all up into one show. So this is from 1922, I think, yeah. And it's Nanook of the North, and it's directed by Robert Flaherty. Now, one thing you got to understand about Robert Flaherty is that he mostly did documentaries, and they usually took him 10 years apiece. He did Louisiana Story and Man from Iran, and Louisiana Story was the only movie, I think, ever to win a Pulitzer Prize. And it's weird because it came out around earlier than a lot of the Pulitzer movies that weren't trying to win the prize but were showing how impossible it was to win, like Ace in the Hole or Face in the Crowd, or which isn't really necessarily about the Pulitzer, but Shock Corridor most certainly is. And we all know that when you're encountering these things, that it's best to win by a default rule. In my case, I wrote 1,000,000 words in a book, so they're not going to deny me by now because it was academic and it had 1,000,000 words, right? Can't be denied with those rule breakers. But let's just say I've never heard of a movie getting it, let alone I don't know how they programmed it to give Louisiana Story one. I mean, you think about the dangerous locale of Louisiana Story, yes, but Nanook of the North is dangerous. So is Man from Iran, where they are on the side of the cliffs in Ireland getting potatoes. I mean, these movies are stark, they're real. Now, Nanook of the North is often criticized by the medium of cinema as having scenes in it about Eskimos that are recreated. Well, they might be recreated, but they're done the same way every time anyway because they rely on such routine. That they build their igloos the same way in this movie showing them build them may not mean that they were building it just for the movie, but that they use the igloo they built for a home makes it pretty authentic. I mean, the fact that they're building an igloo and he's filming the camera, yeah, they might have had to start somewhere else and build it from scratch to get the whole shot. And that's about as fabricated as it gets. These are real Eskimos, real people out in the wild. He's in a dangerous place, has a really heavy camera, and I've seen these Flaherty cameras, and let me tell you, they're these big wooden boxes that have like big latches on the end, and they go down into a trident kind of, kickstand, and then they have this whole big lens on the back, and they crank sometimes. Sometimes you flip the switch, and I've seen those cameras. They're old, they're antiques. You can barely do anything with them now because they were lugged around. Three of them were lugged around for Nanook of the North, I think, even more than that. At one time, they had a 5-camera setup. All these people living authentic lives, and the only recreation is having them do it again. Now, Robert Flaherty's notorious also for working on a film with F.W. Murnau, and how they got together, I'm not real sure of the story, but the story goes they were working on Taboo, which was a lesser-known Robert Flaherty film because it was kind of one of those fetishistic, we're going to the culture and see how they live, but make like this total dreamland utopia out of it, like colonialism, like you go there and all the slaves just like feed you grapes and wave a magic wand at you, and this is Taboo, so it's like Story of the Lost Seas. F.W. Murnau wants to make a kind of happier foreigner film, but he doesn't realize he's making one of those, like fetish put on a pedestal the other culture movies. And besides that, the project was so doomed that actually F.W. Murnau was driving his car and went off a cliff. And even me, being a director, I get scared of going near cliffs because that movie was unplanned. The ideas were still being hacked together. None of the directors were really sure about it, except maybe Murnau. But we'll never know because Murnau didn't even live through like half of the filmmaking, and that was one of the legendary directors that ever lived. That Robert Flaherty had nothing to do with it is true, except they were on a movie together. And I'm telling you, Robert Flaherty's still cursed because Nanook was cursed by people calling it a recreation, which then he admitted that it was, but it was still a documentary, and it's one of the most realistic documentaries ever made. And like I'm saying, if picking up camp and moving it 2 feet is recreation, then by all means, show me how it's done. And then I got this. This is a silent film, so like Louisiana Story and Man of Iran are sound films, and these sound in a really genuine way. But Nanook of the North is a silent film, and the company music on this is beautiful, but there are a lot of things that you can learn from just the visual image of storytelling with a silent film. Because again, we're telling a story visually, and what we're going to connect with is the anthropological outlook of seeing these Indians in camp and being surrounded by igloos and being in a community where they have to kill an animal to eat, and they have to make the animal, they have to cook the animal, and they have to have a lot of furs on them, and this is how they go to bed at night, and this is how they say hi to their wife, and this is how they treat their kids, and this is what their kids do during the day, and here's how we go ice fishing, and it's beauty, art on the highest order. It's a documentary, though, so you get this feeling you're really watching them. So I don't know how many movies were made before this that were documentaries, but there were a lot because if you think about it, the first movies ever made in 1895, December 12th, we said was the Lumiere brothers with a train coming into a station was the first one. And those were all actualities, which were the beginning of the documentaries. They were just shorter. They were only like less than a reel long, most of the documentaries in the early days of cinema. But that documentary was a well-known form. Doesn't mean that many directors worked in documentary, because we're already seeing from Griffith and Fouillard this motivation towards narrative film, which Griffith's only done narrative film. He doesn't do documentaries. And you're like, well, nowadays people do documentaries and narrative, but really the idea of a non-narrative film stems almost from Nanook of the North, even though there's plenty of examples of earlier films. Even some of those Weird Islander movies come around this time, and you're like, is that the idea for Taboo? Because this is a terrible idea, and it's going to end up ruining everyone. It's like someone had read their palm that day, and don't go make a movie on the South Seas, This Nanook of the North is the exact opposite. It's, we're in Nanook is really his name, and we're in the Eskimo territory, and this is the ultimate movie about how to make a documentary. You see from the film angles that a lot of them are shot as establishing shots, and then they'll come a little closer, but they're not really boxy, but they take the trim off like one layer at a time, so there'll be like a big 3-arc shot, and then it'll be a 1-arc shot, and then it'll be down to a close-up on a box, so it like enters that way, and then sometimes it'll fold back out on one side. But the camera usually follows these pretty steady setups. And when they had extra cameras, you could kind of tell because they're switching around the angle within the same take, which is a really good match on action. I'm surprised they were able to do all that and kind of invent this idea of like a verite, you know. I mean, you have to admit it's guerrilla verite in a way, because they're going out there with these cameras and they're just getting it done no matter what they can do, no matter what they have a budget for, whatever. And they're on an expedition, which is barely anybody's going to survive. So that Robert Flaherty knew barely anybody was going to survive on his expeditions. He already knew. That may be one of the factors that led him to the Pulitzer later. But the thing is it's authentic, and it presents a way of storytelling that isn't fictive, and that it's nonfiction is a beautiful thing, and that there's a multiple camera setup to capture everything in a few shots. The match on action is seamless, the reality is seamless, and the verite, truth be told, as it goes on, and not sure how the story's going to end, is actually prevalent in this film, because you can tell as the filmmakers are making it, they don't know how the story's going to come out, but they're excited to see. And really, it is exciting. At the end, they go to sleep, and they get ready for the next day, which is going to be even harder to do when the cameramen leave, because at least then they had assistants for a while. All right, this is a weird one here. We're going straight back to the recent times on this one. And this is a total change of pace from what we were just at. I mean, we're a documentary and 1920s. Now, there is some rhyme and reason to why I'm pointing out what movies I do. I'm prioritizing them by the ones I think you need to know for the class. And really, you don't have to watch the entire film. I recommend watching all these films. So watching all these films would be like a task that would take a couple of years, 3 years maybe. So just get the idea of what you've seen here and an idea about what the movie is, in case you're taking this class and you're thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to see all these movies. And tracking them down is even one of the hard parts. So I understand if you can't track any of these down or whatever, but at least write a paper about your favorite film and get it turned into Coursera. And then they can grade accordingly to how we set up the final in 5 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is. This one is a movie called Moonrise Kingdom. And it's got an all-star cast: Bruce Willis, Bill Murray, Tilda Swinton, Frances McDormand, Edward Norton. I mean, this is an all-star cast. There's more. And you can actually see them in this picture better. That picture was a little out of focus, and I apologize. I have to look right at it. But you can kind of see the caricatures of the characters on here, and actually it's kind of deceiving because on the back is where you see the kids, and the kids are actually the star of the movie. Now, this is an interesting shot setup that Wes Anderson does, who started his career on Bottle Rocket and did Rushmore and did the Royal Tannenbaums. And finally, when he came past Life Aquatic, he did Moonrise Kingdom, which is by far the best movie of the 2K10s. The decade before this one came with a great show of movies, but one of the most memorable ones of that era was Moonrise Kingdom. And Moonrise Kingdom doesn't seem that old of a movie, but considering that it's one of the newest movies we're going to discuss in this class, it's amazing how not recent it was, but that it was like several years ago now is okay. It hasn't dated it a bit. It's still a movie that looks to the future of cinema. And they do this thing with this wonder common. It's like these chambers that you look into, like these pre-cinematic devices, and you see the movie through a box. And we get this feeling with Wes Anderson, especially here with the pageantry. See, because at the end of the movie, there's a big storm, and I won't give too many spoilers away, but some Boy Scouts have been on the loose. And they get trapped in this church, and in the church, there's this big choir singing, and there's this passion play going on, but we're with these South Park animals. Not that they're being crude, because the whole movie's PG-13. There's barely anything in it. There's a little bit of some kids making out and doing some things like that, but that might bother some people. I could understand, but if it bothers you, I don't know why it would, but it could. So beware. There's kids making out in it. Okay, if you're worried about that, but a girl and a boy run away from the Boy Scouts, and they kind of live near each other anyway. So why they didn't wait till Boy Scout camp was over, it doesn't matter. That they pull this Pierre Le Fou and go off to some island. Of course, they're not gangsters, but He does shoot one of the other Boy Scouts with an arrow when they try to come fetch him. That Edward Norton leads the troop and that Bill Murray and Bruce Willis are the concerned parents of the children is true, but most of theirs is a quest to find the kids, and then the storm starts, and like I said, there is a pageant in the church. But the whole movie's put on like a pageant, and like when Battle Rocket came out, there's like, and Rushmore, there's an invitation inviting you to the movie, in the movie, and we still get this feeling that there's like these masterpiece theater, like shade drapes in front of the proscenium, and then they're pulled up and we see these rooms that have like these wondercommers. They're like these boxes where things will kind of slightly move or stay centered. Like in a Barry Lyndon setup, they'll stay centered and only one thing will move or hardly anything will move. And with these dimensions, you can even see how Wes Anderson has worked it into his animation films with Fantastic Mr. Fox. And that he's done so many things with the camera being in this room of the box. Now he's doing tracking shots from box to box. And now he's revealing information from one side of the screen to another, barely concealing the previous information, and then maybe concealing it only by means of the shot having to move. Now, I know we're getting a little bit of verbiage going on here, and I don't want to make this class as long because I feel like I've been preaching at you about these movies, and I feel like I'm giving you a lot of movies at once, and tonight we have 3 more to go through that are daunting. But Moonrise Kingdom captures the innocence of childhood and the innocence of being childlike. But the faith of a child is always captured in Wes Anderson, and his auteur style is a rites of passage, that is the passage from youth to adulthood by means of growth because of some kind of conflict and character resolution. That it's a melodrama comedy hybrid is kind of interesting because those are hard to do, that you can have a bittersweet serious moment and a laugh them up, we just fell off our rope moment here is absolutely true. And I find that in this movie that the children are the main issue and that they do appear to foe. I mean, there's a wave lapping up on this record player with this record sitting there, and the wave laps up on it and scratches it up and everything. You can tell that this is one of those cinemas for the sake of cinema movies, and that it's no holds barred on how much they spent on it for minimal things, and that the pageantry show is no laughing matter at the end with the lightning, and that the whole movie is a pageant. I love, but that it's about the Boy Scouts of America, and they're all American, and they're being prepared, and they're all ready to go, and this is the Boy Scout movie to end all Boy Scout movies. And really, there aren't many Boy Scout movies from our era, if there ever were. I mean, like, there were probably some, Mickey Rooney type Boy Scout movies that everybody liked. But I'm talking about, like, just, have we ever seen a movie about a big Boy Scout league like this? Or are they as clandestine as, like, other secret groups? Or do they come out every 2017 years and make a movie? I don't know. But they're authentic. The suits are authentic. The badges are authentic. I wouldn't be surprised if all those kids had to go to Boy Scout camp before the making of the movie. That's not in the Criterion folklore is too bad, because I would have liked to seen, and then they all went to Boy Scout. I mean, they have to go to boot camp to be in a war movie. Why can't these kids go to Boy Scout camp to be real Boy Scouts? But that they're as convincing as Boy Scouts as the Eskimos in Nanook of the North is true. And now we move on to my favorite gutbuster of the 90s. And again, these are listed in priority of the movies that you've got to see. I mean, if you don't see them, make an effort to know what they are. And if you don't know what they are, at least get the name and director and kind of look them up online and peruse like IMDb and peruse like websites about the film. And you can look anywhere, on new films. It's good to read, like Entertainment Weekly is a good magazine for new films. Entertainment Today, if you're in LA, I've written for them. They're a good publication. Naked Lunch. That's the next one. Now, first, I got to tell you a little bit about the story. The Beat era generation with Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs, as we're about to discuss. They were writing books that they didn't even know each other were writing, but somehow had a transcendental meditation connection. They could all sense each other were writing books, so they met in Chicago. There was all this stuff going on with these poets that were getting banned and people that were accused of being communists. Well, I don't really know if any of those guys that were accused of being communist ever were, but some of them might have taken the rap just for not knowing what it was, and some of them might have clearly thought, I want to take the rap for that. I'm not, but I will be. And then some of them were and didn't really care if they had to go to jail for it, because they were like, well, I'm busted. But anyway, Naked Lunch is interesting because William Burroughs was one of those that blurred the line between whether there was even an existence of any isms like communism or capitalism or anything existed, because to him it was all just like dogma trapped in a box, and that he was a stream of conscious member of the Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg school, but not writing poetry or writing a book called Naked Lunch. All came to a head when the book came out and got sued for defamation laws against censorship, and the book itself is tormented, it's vulgar, there's aliens, there's plagues, there's things that come at them, there's aliens that attack them, you know. And Roy Scheider's in it, and he's really good in it. And he wears his suit, and he takes off his suit, and he's an alien underneath, or he's an alien on top, and he takes off his alien suit, and he's him underneath. And Peter Weller's the main character, though, and he's this, just like in the book, it follows this salesman of bug powder, but like somehow the bug powder is like addictive or something, so he eats all this bug powder, and then he feeds his typewriter bug powder because it's turning into a bug, but it turns out that these bugs get mutant and big, and they're aliens, and they like thrive off of bug powder. So now this bug salesman is going to prison because he created all these monsters, and they're all killing him, and yet he's got the stuff they need. And it's a really weird book because it doesn't really comment on like any kind of abuse of chemicals or anything. It's not really covering that. It's like saying something about the brand he had was like makes you kind of like stronger or a mutant or feel better. And I don't really think they're commenting on anything because the aliens are the ones that are becoming mutants from it. And actually the people that aren't aliens, except for Peter Weller and a few others, even crave it. And that he's a, bug, that he goes around spraying for bugs, and that he kills bugs with a sprayer, and then they get bigger and choke up the world with this alien galaxy almost, like the world becomes this alien galaxy. Well, that's similar to the book. That there's some kind of like Marquis de Sade satanic ritual with like virgins and blood dripping and stuff does happen often. But that's because the book is more about the chemical use of things. But the movie really isn't, because Cronenberg makes it all fiction, takes us on this time travel mission, and shows us the life of William S. Burroughs, especially while he was writing Naked Lunch. And it's a biography of William S. Burroughs, as well as this kind of dystopian, futuristic, I created a monster but didn't mean to, now I've unleashed Pandora's box, and have to either destroy it or keep it thriving. Which is in the book, but that's like the framework for him to go crazy, like, let's kill Mussolini and then bring Mussolini back from the grave, like Solo style over here in the book. Stream of consciousness scaring you, but now you've got David Cronenberg saying, but he made wrote this book with a typewriter in a dark room in Hollywood, and the shed was closed that he was in, and he had this close lit light up, and he was probably seeing a cockroach occasionally skitter by. That's probably what caused the whole book to erupt in bug violence at one point in the book. And that Naked Lunch follows a film noir pattern is true too, that it uses shading of the lighting and image to counterbalance the fact that it's made like a stark modern but yet black and white film noir. And that's not because there's just one light setup. You'll see lights outside in the city that illuminate the night, and some travel in vehicles in this movie that's really unlike any other traveling shots I've seen. But because they're used in kind of a time travel shuffle, I can't really explain why they're riding in the cars, although Peter Weller is confronted by an alien in one of the cars. It's so fantastic here, other than in Alphaville and in Pulp Fiction when they use the spinning lights behind the car. Cronenberg's got them here too. Cronenberg's got the spinning lights in the mirror too. And that is a beautiful thing, and I think that we should all just sit back and let this film unfold, because if William S. Burroughs ever went through that typing that story, then I blame the censorship laws for telling him he should bleed it out, because it's true, it's not pictures, but the David Cronenberg's pictures pretty much match the satanic demonic orgy of the book is true, but that the movie does it in kind of like this didn't really happen except in my head kind of way, even though it's what the writer probably went through to get the book out. And in the book, is a little scarier because it takes it even further, but with words, and you're actually more offended by just hearing the words than seeing the movie as a tribute to like the power of literature and how literature, even in this case, can override a perfect masterpiece in being even more obscure in its meaning to hide from anyone any conflict resolution. And the ultimate ending is totally, farewell to the new flesh, death to Videodrome. It's one of these line recyclers that end up having you hit the pause button and rewind several times to make sure you just saw the ending. So this is a 4-star movie. If you're into scary books and you want to read just the trial at the end where they have the liturgy text of what happened in the trial, and they say that it was Burroughs trying to defend his book, and Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were trying to defend William Burroughs' book and saying it's just like theirs. It's a rebellion on society because society's gotten too like conservative in its mores, or that it's coming down on people that are having fun, or society cuts down on gay people. We're not going to take it anymore, but in a nice way. But William Burroughs, the idea of rebelling because of anti-authoritarianism isn't necessarily overwrought. It's just pointed out every once in a while. And if briefly in some cases, it's a reminder that after most sci-fi authors read and studied 1984, that the words thought crime have become part of the story is true, and that you can kind of tell that in this movie, the bugs appear whenever there's a thought crime, or a thought crime will happen and then a bug will be there. It's like a thought we didn't mean to have, but that we're apologizing for it in our own mind because we had it. Not that I have any. They can't bust me for any of those because I don't have those. But this movie does teach you about thought crime, and that's just because 1984 came before this, and every movie talks about thought crime since then. And speaking of 1984, we're going to move on to the next movie. But Naked Lunch, yeah, not for the squeamish, but if you're into a mutant, crazy, orchestrated, beautiful, and nicely jazz riffy score, and if you want to see Hunter S. Thompson writing a book while the movie's being made, type movie. Peter Weller plays William S. Burroughs perfectly, and that he's a bug catcher, and that he creates monsters with it is already seen again and through it in A Scanner Darkly by Richard Linklater, the rotoscoped cartoon. This is the next movie we're moving to. And I don't know what to say except for that we've talked about this movie a little bit, Brazil. But what I want to go into it, again, is that when Terry Gilliam directed Brazil, George Lucas has called it a masterpiece, and we've already discussed that. But what we need to discuss is that Brazil has an ending in the film that is like Occurrence at Owl Creek. Now, Occurrence at Owl Creek we've already talked about, and this is a really important film to note because it's at the end of the film, the man is hanged on a chair. And I've said this before, but this is at the beginning of the film now, and now it's asynchronous because it has a scene from the end at the beginning, but when we're watching the beginning, we don't realize for a second that we're flashing back up to the point from earlier in his life, a quick flashback of a series of photographs, or filmed photographs, all the way to the point of him being hung. And we see the crime he did to get hung at one point. We see the girls he was romantically involved with when he's younger. We see him as like younger, and it's like his life is flashing before his eyes while he's being hung, and at the end of the movie he goes down and is hung, and he sees the whole thing before. Well, in Brazil, not to give too many spoilers away, and while there's like 8 different movie versions of this movie, I've seen a lot of different versions of this movie. And there's Michael Palin's in it, Robert De Niro's in it, Jonathan Pryce. And at the end of the movie, it has the Jacob's Ladder, Last Temptation of Christ. And Last Temptation of Christ, Willem Dafoe's on the cross, and then he flashes forward to things he could do in his life, like get married, have kids, which wouldn't be sinful, but then he wouldn't be creating a sacrifice for the people to apologize for their sins. And I don't really know how all that works, but I do know that Christ would have gotten married if he didn't have to go to the cross. I mean, he'd probably do that anyway if he didn't have to go to the cross, but in the movie Last Temptation, it was really weird because there were people like burning themselves on Martin Scorsese's lawn, trying to get him to ban it. And I think what offended people was Christ does die on the cross, but the what if of him getting married shows him in a married life with Mary Magdalene. There's the word again. And he has a wife and kids. So this is the protest against the movies. When you're watching it, you think that's really happening. So when it peers back on the cross at the end, you realize that was the delay of time while he was, from the point that he almost died to while he was dying, all the flashbacks filled his head to when he died. And we never know the exact time as the time elapsed, but that these movies, this one is about 2 hours and a half, 2 hours, 45 minutes, depending on the edited version you see, or the Criterion version. This is the Criterion Blu-ray. Beautiful score. There's a scene where like people are coming to the main office of the building where like information retrieval. Jonathan Pryce works in there with a computer and it's just like messed up monitor screen. And like every time he looks up, like, you know, his boss looks up and he notices that the people are like working diligently, and then he looks back to the movie and this like Brazil music goes off and they're throwing papers everywhere and they're bugging things out and they're throwing everything, and then the boss looks back up and then they're going back to normal. I mean, these are the types of settings Terry Gilliam has a lot of times in his film where it's structureless, structureless, or the opposite. Like you have this scene in Terry Gilliam's Fisher King, which I'm covering a lot, but here we go. There's this part where Robin Williams is walking to grasp hold of this date, and she's walking in front of him, and they're dancing. And all of a sudden, the whole city breaks out into dancing all over the city. Everybody's, you know, waltzing in this big circle, and there's this beautiful music playing, and everybody's waltzing. And he can't quite get to her, and that they've danced before, but that he can't get to her now because there's dancers everywhere. There's a total Terry Gilliam, have these structureless movements moving through these giant creative structures of dancing. And then we have these in Brazil, not just the scene where he throws the papers, but we get another idea that there's too much paperwork in this film, not only by the pipes erupting and papers going everywhere, but Robert De Niro in the final hallucination scene, which I'm getting to, is swept out by a pile of papers. Now, this is before I get to Brazil. Jacob's Ladder is one in which the soldiers are put on this substance that makes them hallucinate. And so the whole movie, we don't know till the end that they've just been going from a moment they almost died to the point they died in about a 2.5 hour movie. So in Brazil, the timing is more like last 40 minutes by the moment he dies to the moment he doesn't die. And in Jacob's Ladder, it's 2 hours. It's usually the length of the film from a moment they were going to die in those time frames in those movies. Even Last Temptation, which was about 30 minutes at the end, or 35 minutes at the end, and then Occurrence at Owl Creek, which the whole movie's only 8 minutes. So then in Brazil, the last 40 minutes are weird because they're about to give Jonathan Pryce a lobotomy. And then suddenly everything goes into dream world, and it's back to the real movie where you have these, like, at first you get these ideas that like people are treating their skin with like chemical therapy or something, and their skin is falling off. And they're trying to stay younger, and they're bandaging their skin back and stuff and having facelifts. And that's his mom, and his mom apparently in the dream has a facelift, and she turns into Sam's girlfriend, and I call him Sam Lowry, but it's Jonathan Pryce, right? And Jonathan Pryce does in the hallucination, which we don't know is a hallucination until the end. And that's what makes these kind of endings so special. You don't know until the end that the whole thing was just from the moment he almost died to dying, the light flash into his eyes of what could have been, what already happened, or any other memory that enters in. Like that may not even be a real memory, but just comes into the movie. And in Brazil, there's plenty of those. One thing that's interesting about this movie is he's always taking on the samurai form, Jonathan Pryce, in his dreams. That he's flying around, that he's like a vision through the skies, that he's cutting through the clouds is beautiful. That they play that beautiful music again, the big swell of music comes up. And I can only tell you that this film will excite you. I mean, it has buildings getting picked up and taking off. It has trucks driving through like wide road shelters. It has these big heavenly buildings that lead all through these dungeons down deep and all through these ladders up top, and that people keep busting down through roofs on Christmas to find terrorists, and the terrorists have gotten all mixed up, and now De Niro is a superhero but is being labeled as some bad guy like he's really done anything wrong, and just because he fixes people's pipes without using paperwork, and as we all know, he's killed by paperwork in the hallucination. It sweeps and destroys him in some kind of final quake of the mind that Jonathan Pryce has been having this whole time. And if, I know George Lucas loves this film. I know that it comes from the school of thought crime. They can tell what you're thinking before you're thinking it. This movie can tell what you're thinking before you're thinking it. This movie will direct your attention to think something and then make you think that you came up with that right before it comes on. And that's the Terry Gilliam Monty Python style, which we got to talk about because we're going to get to Terry Gilliam in fantasy at some point. The Terry Gilliam really brought back the fantasy genre in the 80s and 90s is true, and that he's one of the heralded directors of the fantasy genre is amazing because his fantasy is really challenging, and while it has political satire and psychological edges to it, it's not necessarily condemning of politics and satire of religion, and satire of politics. Psychology aren't exactly condemning even of politics. And that they kind of work together in a hopeful way is in these films, but that it never works out is practically a signature of Gilliam said, well, that's tough luck. Like, we just went for it and we didn't make it, but we went balls out, and we almost crushed the wall. You can see this kind of Gilliam behavior in The Man Who Shot, from La Mancha, The Man Who Shot Don Quixote, because there's this documentary of Lost in La Mancha where Terry Gilliam's trying to make that film, The Man Who Shot Don Quixote. And he's getting really demanding, and he's not really figuring out where the things went that they bought for the movie. And there's like this camp of like these costume Satanists are supposed to go film, and he could never find them, and they were doing chanting in the way they were asked to, and that they were off somewhere else doing their thing, and Gilliam's trying to figure it out. But plus the movie did have shots of them, but he didn't know they got them, and that whole movie got delayed, and then a tornado blew through the set like usual. Like, if it's a big movie that you're going gung-ho for, you got to have a tornado blow through the set, like the hurricane and Apocalypse Now, whoosh, out the set, bro. And that's when you just got to get your recuperation funds and see if you can assemble it all together. And I'm telling you, the fantasy scenes in this with him dreaming as flying samurai through the clouds and fighting the giant samurai that's even more huge than him, and fighting all the monsters he fights, and watching his girlfriend get caged, and then finally ending up with her, even though she didn't like him for being kind of a stalker that found him in the computer, that saved her from the company that was going to destroy her for knowing that she knew the guy that they were trying to kill, and she found out the guy the government killed wasn't the right guy. And that's how this whole anarchy starts, ends with a lobotomy, a dream sequence, the mom becomes the daughter, and next thing you know, he's in such a dream world that we can't really know what's dreaming and what's not until the ending, when his lobotomy is complete. They ride off. And they all make some comment in all these films, Jacob's Ladder, Last Temptation of Christ. Well, he put up a good fight at the end, but he didn't quite survive that one. Or whatever kooky thing they say. And then you're like, oh, so it's the fourth occurrence of Val Creek. It's the four occurrences of Val Creek. That's the real name of the movie. It's Jacob's Ladder, Last Temptation of Christ, Brazil, and Occurrence at Val Creek. And that there's other movies that do this is true, but those are the only ones the theorist has to be accountable for, because they're only ones that have that exact meaning. The moment right before you die, to the moment you die, you flash images in your mind, be it the future, the past, the present, a non-reality. And whatever that is mixed in between is the length of the movie. And that's my theory, and I'm going for it. But that the length might be altered in Jacob's Ladder does have to do with how time duration on that material did kind of fold. And there's notes of that worthy in here. But I'm going to say that they were precise about cutting what exactly it would have been right before the final moment of their death if they were doing that procedure. Although I'm not sure if that's true, because I don't really want to study lobotomies too much, and from what I understand, they knock you out right away. Now, I've got one more movie to share with you tonight, and it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun time, because we're going to take a break after this one. Maybe not come back for a few days. But in Masterclass, I had to get one off the shelves that I've been talking about. But now I need to really spell it out, because this is really what we need to switch gears to. And I was going to show you another Kubrick movie tonight, but I think we'll wait on that one, because I think what we need to look at is this. And people are probably booing me as they see the cover, but I've got American Graffiti right here on Blu-ray, and you think, well, this one wasn't hard to find. I've got it on Blu-ray from Target, that it has a digital copy and like some scratch games on here, and like all these, it's got this cartoon of the Mel's Diner. Now, I'm sorry that's not focusing very well. It's supposed to focus better, but it's like a cartoon picture, like the old teen pics were, and it's made in like this kind of pre-Animal House, still youth is innocent, but youth is about to have a rite of passage. Now, one thing we talked about with Wes Anderson was that the child going from the adult going from the child to adult, through that phase, he's developing childhood. And in this case, he can get like this kind of Oedipal condition where he, gravitates towards returning to his mother's womb, and he gravitates towards, kind of abolishing his father, because his father will take away his mother and his mother will protect him from his father, these things. And this is kind of a pre-Oedipal condition in like the nucleus of a family, like in the family narrative that a guy marries a girl and they have kids, and now a boy and a girl, and they live together, and that's how we settle this. And the American dream, and like everybody has these like families with kids and they all live stably, these nuclear families. But then the Oedipal condition really comes into that with the mirror phase, which is after the phase where the child has noticed their, specific parts that make them different than the opposite sex and things like that. And I don't want to get too into child psychology, except for that at the birth of the moment they realize they're going to have to be adults to deal with adult things in an adult manner, usually comes from when they're kids and they have to deal with adult things in an adult manner, and they do it well. And that's how the rite of passage comes about. Whether they become the full-blown adult or not, they've already passed the phase where they've had to think like an adult. And adults are always sorry that they get into that position, but that they have to think like an adult to get themselves out of the situation is actually the rite of passage, where they usually have to act in terms of getting themselves out of the situation. And sometimes that does mean abolishing the father character, like you can see in Moonrise Kingdom, and gravitating towards mom. However, the moms are so scared that their kids are gone that they're not too happy with their husbands. And that's kind of a joke that Wes Anderson plays, like, this is what happens when our kids get lost. But American Graffiti is interesting because dropping the movie, it's a good thing it's made of titanium. American Graffiti is a good one because the whole movie is practically what I love making movies about, is like when you're riding in a car, and you ride in a car most of this movie. I mean, there's one car or another, and they're all classy, souped up cars nobody really talks about. Where Coppola and Lucas dug up all these cars at, but that they're like these Rebel Without a Cause type cars going down by Mel. And Mel's Diner, which is in this, by the way, is actually a real restaurant in LA. And I can't remember if they built it for the movie, I think it was already there, and then you can go to it still, and it's the one they go to in the movie, but they cleared it all out and made it a movie set for the movie, but like you can still eat there, and I think it was open beforehand. And it was a real place in LA, and that like this takes place in the 60s but was made in the 70s. I'm going to say something about this. It has the best soundtrack of all time except for the movie Nashville. It scores high on every soundtrack list. And I know I'd mentioned some other soundtracks before that were really good, but the American Graffiti and Nashville soundtracks are the most amazing ones. And I know I'm forgetting one too. Performance has a good soundtrack. There are movies with good soundtracks, Quadrophenia has a great soundtrack. In fact, Quadrophenia would have a better soundtrack than this if it wasn't technically labeled as a rock opera. And this one is actually a soundtrack where you take tracks from other mixes, usually from the radio. And in this, they had this guy, Wolfman Jack, who either was already a legend on the radio, then did the part in the movie as a nonfiction character in a fiction world, and then went on to be Wolfman Jack as the DJ afterwards. If that was the same guy, which it probably was, because they say it kind of is in this, that there's an authentic look. That Ron Howard's in the cast is interesting, considered Ron Howard became the director that worked for Lucas on Willow, is really a page turner. That Harrison Ford's driving one of the cars is interesting. That there's a whole slew of other cast and crew in it that have found their way in and out of teen picks from around this time. That it's a teen pick in the 70s is kind of weird, because everybody's making these like Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs movies, and here comes the leader of THX with his weirdest movie, which is just a teeny bopper flick about, should we get a hamburger, or should we go get with our girlfriend, or should we get a hamburger then go get with our girlfriend? And that's what they usually provide in doing. Now, what I'm saying about a soundtrack is you select music from the radio. In this case, it's on the radio, but that was music that played in the 60s mainly, that was sometimes from the 50s, is what makes this soundtrack so unique. And that there are other soundtracks that we've come across even on this journey that are just as good. That Singing in the Rain probably has an even better soundtrack, but I consider that more of a musical, where the music not only is intrinsic to the film, but was written for the film. Now that the music in this seems like it was written for the film, is how it's edited and how it's produced. But the music came out way before the movie did in most all the cases, unless there's one or two recent ones, which there could be, because I'm not as researched on how they went from like 5 cases of music down to the final narrow down ones they did. I know when they were going to make this, they were going to make it a musical, and everybody was lining up to get ready to make a musical. And I know that Ron Howard had done some work as a kid on the Andy Griffith Show and as an actor, but that he was going to turn over to Roger Corman and then go down the road of the USC grads that became the biggest filmmakers on earth, like when he did the Da Vinci Code, is wild to think. But the fact that George Lucas was set in 1973 before Star Wars, that he's already scoring with Coppola even after THX bombed, was purely on a student film that he showed Coppola. That George Lucas's student films are so amazing, and one of them even features a race car that drives around the edge of it's being remotely controlled, but there's a guy operating it too, and it's this unique movie of a car. Reminds me of where he's going to get the idea from the final crash in THX and some of the fender benders in American Graffiti and the little things that happen there and there. It's interesting because the little details that cause conflict, the very few conflicts in this film, are actually smoothed out, but somehow left a little open-ended for the sake of open-ending. Like when Richard Dreyfuss, who's also great in this, he goes off, to college at the end, and he's got to leave his girl, he's got to leave his town, he's got to leave everything behind and go to college, and he's thinking it's a great idea, but at the end he's looking as solemn as it is in The Graduate that he's actually leaving, and he's not sure if he's really thinking he should have never left and should go back. And the night of his life was the night before, and they all got with their girls, and they all said goodbye, and they all did the right thing, and they all conflict resolutioned it by meeting the DJ Wolfman Jack out at his radio house, and I think it's a beautiful film. And I think the use of lighting's interesting because in Star Wars we see all these vehicles with lights going by, and some of the prequels, like in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, where we see these like taxi type flying cars that we almost see in the Fifth Element. It's like they're all lifted flying cars, and they're on these different roads, and the Jedi fly through there. And I think there's a certain quality about the roads. The roads are packed with like these lights, and there's all these, and again we had the hoop circlings, like we had Naked Lunch, and they're all going down these drag races and dragnets. And now one movie that could probably challenge the soundtrack is Pulp Fiction. We never talked about the Pulp Fiction, and we know Nashville, though it is a tracked out movie that they learned the parts for to film, it still counts, although it's kind of a musical too, and we don't really define this as a musical. That's why I think it's a superior soundtrack than most, because they picked the songs that would go with the right images that they knew they were making for the music, but also for the screen, and that also it developed as it went, and that George Lucas was banking on it this time because THX lost some money, and he really wanted to prove to everyone that he could make a film that would hold up. And it's pivotal for knowing that this movie is the reason that Star Wars was made. Because when American Graffiti made it big, George Lucas got just enough ambition to carry out Episode 4. And we'll get to all the Star Wars later. That anyone that's a Star Wars fan would like this too, probably. That it is geared towards the whole family, definitely. And that they do get with their girls, it's like in an innocent way, and who doesn't, it's not like you're going to have like a long conversation with your kids to tell them what love is, and how people fall in love, and that it's less bumpy and less wild than Rebel Without a Cause isn't so much that Rebel Without a Cause isn't straighter and narrower, but that Rebel Without a Cause deals with hard conflicts, and American Graffiti deals with, should I get a burger, and should I get with my girl, and win. And that's like the dilemma that we all want to be stuck in, because that's the dilemma we're in on graduation or any other night in high school is, and it's the same idea that it's a rite of passage, that they're growing from teenagers into adults, and that they're doing that by crossing the threshold of where they have to act like adults and be like adults to have the rite of passage. Whether they then turn into the adult right away or grow into it or are ambiguous toward it also depends on how their trajectory from something psychological you could see, like the Oedipus myth. So I'm going to conclude there because I think I promised you a shorter class, and we didn't exactly have a shorter class, but it was a good one. And I feel we'll talk about Full Metal Jacket next time. And if I can find any other these soundtrack contenders, we'll talk. But I'm telling you, the 1950s score is a real bebop rock and roll through the syncopated rhythm of early rock and how the rock developed. And Wolfman Jack defining how those songs developed as part of the movie. And I think that one of the things that adds atmosphere is you kind of get this nostalgia for how things were in high school. And that's a postmodern technique, that nostalgia, like how we always look back and remember what we were thinking the first time we watched American Graffiti down to the what time, and that there's no thought crime there, that you really can say you want a burger is not a thought crime. And, it's interesting how American Graffiti doesn't deal with like karma like Star Wars does, but that they've all got good karma because they're in their youth, and then they challenge growing old, and then they don't maybe grow old, but they have to take responsibility somewhere along the line. Is definitely prevalent in American Graffiti, and the nostalgia of the music adds to the whole scene, as though these classic cars, nostalgic music, diners and DJ huts and roads and streetways all look like the place we love most, home, whether it's the city or with our friends or with our family, or all the things we do and the fun we like to have and the good times we like to look back on. So we thank the filmmakers for that.